The man known to history as King Stephen of England was born sometime in the mid-1090s. Some historians, recognized authorities on his life and reign, propose a birth year as early as 1092, while others suggest he might have been born as late as 1096. It is crucial to keep this in mind, particularly when considering events of the 1100s and 1110s, as the 4-year span significantly impacts evaluating whether Stephen's actions during these periods were those of a child, a teenager, or a young man. There is greater agreement regarding his place of birth, and it is generally accepted that he was born in the town of Blois, located in the Loire Valley between Orléans and Tours. Stephen's father was Stephen Henry, Count of Blois, a prominent French feudal lord of the late 11th century. He was already approximately 50 years old when Stephen was born. If Stephen's birth year was 1096, then he would have arrived after his father had departed for the Holy Land to participate in the First Crusade, aiming to retake Jerusalem for the Christian cause. Stephen's mother was Adela of Normandy. Born in the latter half of the 1060s, she was a daughter of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 led a Norman army across the English Channel and commenced the conquest of England. Right around the time Adela was born, her marriage to Stephen Henry in the early 1080s constituted a political union designed to forge an alliance between her father, by then King William I of England, and the Count of Blois. Her father passed away in 1087 and was succeeded by his son, Adela's brother, King William II, more widely known as William Rufus, most likely a reference to his red hair or beard. Consequently, when Stephen was born in the mid-1090s, his uncle held the title of King of England. Stephen's wider family wielded influence beyond England itself. When William the Conqueror conquered England, he was already the Duke of Normandy and had extended his authority over certain other adjoining territories in northern France as well, such that the family controlled lands on both sides of the English Channel. Indeed, the Conqueror viewed his primary role as that of Duke of Normandy, even after conquering England, and he spent a considerable portion of the 1070s and 1080s in France. Even after becoming ruler of England, after his death, his territories were not passed undivided to William Rufus. Instead, the Conqueror's other sons, Robert and Henry, played a more significant role in Normandy and the other French territories, while William Rufus governed England. This arrangement was disrupted in August 1100 when the king was killed during a suspicious hunting accident in the New Forest in Hampshire, England. When this occurred, his brother Henry moved swiftly to seize power and became the new monarch as King Henry I of England. With this, Stephen, who was still a child, aged between 4 and 8, depending on his birth year, exchanged having one uncle as King of England for another, while his third uncle, Robert, would maintain control over Normandy for several years to come, although in 1106 he was defeated militarily by Henry at the Battle of Tinchebray and imprisoned for the remainder of his life. Consequently, much of Stephen's life would be spent under the influence of his powerful uncle, who from 1106 onwards controlled England and the family's territories in Normandy and elsewhere in northern France. As with any monarch of the High Middle Ages, only a small number of administrative records or examples of correspondence have survived the nearly 1,000 years since Stephen's time that might illuminate his life. As a result, we are largely dependent on the histories and chronicles of the era to reconstruct the events involving Stephen and the part he played in them. These were predominantly authored by ecclesiastical figures, monks, abbots, and bishops who were close to those in authority. One such work was the Historia Novella, or New History, by William of Malmesbury, a highly learned monk born in the mid-1090s, and thus an exact contemporary of Stephen's. The Benedictine monk Orderic Vitalis penned an ecclesiastical history which covers the period up to 1141 and provides extensive insight into Stephen's life before becoming King of England in the initial years of his reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a lengthy account of the history of medieval England, offers an illuminating narrative of the damage inflicted upon the social and economic fabric of England by the civil wars of the 1140s, in which, as we shall see, Stephen was so central. Finally, the Gesta Stephani, or Acts of Stephen, is perhaps the most valuable source of all for Stephen's tenure as King of England. The text was anonymous, though some historians of 12th century England argue it was composed by Robert of Bath, the Bishop of Bath between 1136 and 1166, and an eyewitness to many of the events described in the Gesta. Unfortunately, because it could not have been foreseen that Stephen would one day become King of England, he was evidently raised at home in Blois. He had numerous siblings, including an elder brother named William. Under typical circumstances, in a society where primogeniture, the concept that the eldest son would inherit a noble title, was emerging in its complete form, it might have been anticipated that Stephen would live his life in the shadow of his older brother. However, William is believed to have been intellectually challenged in some manner. There is no explicit description of this, but he earned the rather coarse epithet William the Simple, which likely indicates some psychological or mental issue, one that largely prevented him from taking an active role in political and military matters. In his stead, Stephen and their other older brother Theobald emerged early on as the most capable of Stephen, Henry, and Adela's sons. Another brother of theirs, Odo, died at a young age. Stephen received a respectable education during these years by the standards of the time. Whereas his grandfather, William the Conqueror, was illiterate, Stephen was taught to read and write and could comprehend Latin, a marker of the burgeoning Renaissance in learning that was occurring across Europe during this period as the continent's first universities were established and began to produce new generations of scholars and teachers. Stephen's father was absent during his earliest years. He took part in the First Crusade to the Holy Land, which succeeded in establishing several Christian states there in 1098 and 1099. The Count of Blois' contribution to the effort was questionable. Though he was present at the siege of the city of Antioch in 1098, he abandoned the crusade to return home at a crucial point in the assault on the city. To make matters worse, he is believed to have encountered the Byzantine Emperor Alexios of Komnenos on his journey back through Anatolia, and convinced the emperor that the crusade was a lost cause and that he should not advance to assist the Christian armies. In the event, he proved entirely incorrect in his analysis, and after the successful capture of Antioch, the Crusaders proceeded to conquer nearly the entirety of the region, approximating modern-day Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, as well as parts of Syria and Jordan. During his absence in the east, Stephen's mother, Adela, headed a regency government in Blois. She evidently enjoyed the power it conferred upon her, and as soon as her husband returned to France, she began attempting to persuade him to head back east on the crusade as quickly as possible. He eventually agreed to do so, and in 1101 departed again for the Levant. He reached Jerusalem on this occasion, where a Crusader kingdom had been founded after his premature flight home in 1098. The following year, before he could return to France having fulfilled his vow to visit the Holy City, he was captured by an Islamic army and executed shortly thereafter. Hence, apart from a brief interval in 1099 and 1100 when he was back in France, Stephen's recollection of his father would have been almost non-existent. He grew up much closer to his mother, Adela, and, unusually for a noble child at the time, was raised in her household. When news of their father's death reached France, Stephen's older brother, Theobald, was made Count of Blois, though he was only 11 or 12 years old at the time, and Adela would continue to act as regent for several years to come. While Theobald had succeeded as Count of Blois upon their father's death, this certainly did not prevent Stephen from aspiring to a position of authority in France, or the wider realm of Western Europe. This was particularly the case in light of the challenging circumstances prevailing in England and Normandy. Henry thereby had over 20 children, but most were born from relationships outside of marriage and thus, by the standards of medieval Europe, could not be considered legitimate successors to his dominions. Conversely, he had postponed marriage considerably, not finally wedding his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, until 1100 when Henry was already in his 30s, an advanced age for marriage by the standards of the High Middle Ages. Having married, the union did result in 2 children in rapid succession, a daughter named Matilda after her mother in the spring of 1102, and a son named William Adelin in August 1103. Thereafter, the marriage produced no further children, and so the succession to Henry rested primarily on just one legitimate male heir, William Adelin. Given the precarious nature of the succession and the absence of a backup male heir, Henry began taking an interest in his nephew during the 1100s. It indicated Stephen's promise as he matured that his uncle increasingly viewed him as someone who might play a major role in the governance of the French portion of his dominions in Normandy and adjacent territories. This advancement of young Stephen occurred in the years after 1106, following Henry's defeat of his brother Robert and seizure of the Duchy of Normandy. In response to Henry's imprisonment of Robert, King Louis VI of France began promoting the claim of William Clito, Robert's son and heir, to succeed as Duke of Normandy. This placed Henry in a difficult situation, as governing his newly acquired French territories from England was not straightforward. Therefore, he commenced constructing an alliance of friendly French nobles who would serve to protect Normandy from attacks by Louis and the other supporters of William Clito. Part of this involved cultivating his sister and the lords of the county of Blois, and he did so by showing favor to Adela's preferred son, Stephen. This involved Stephen spending significant periods in Henry's entourage when he visited Normandy and held court at Rouen. By the late 1100s, Stephen may have been as old as 16 or 17, and thus was also in a position to accompany Henry on military campaigns in northern France. He even played a leading role in 1111 in suppressing the revolt of Robert of Bellême, a Norman lord with holdings in both England and the county of Ponthieu in France. The following year, Henry knighted Stephen, by which time he was at least 16 years old and perhaps as much as 20. Henry's patronage and promotion of his nephew continued in the years that followed. In the mid-1110s, Stephen crossed the English Channel to visit England for the first time and was granted extensive privileges there. These included the honor of Lancaster, a feudal fief in the Lancaster region of England, which made Henry one of the foremost feudal lords of the country at a very young age. Further grants of land in the Alençon region of southern Normandy and elsewhere in France ensued. All of this was conspicuous by the late 1110s. It could be argued that Henry was advancing Stephen in a highly unusual manner, almost as one would his designated heir. Perhaps this stemmed from reservations the king held about his own son and successor, William Adelin. William reached his 14th year in 1117 and began his transition into adulthood by the standards of the 12th century. He may have proven something of a disappointment as he matured. One chronicler of the time described him as a pampered prince who would be consumed by the volatile and aggressive politics of the time. But as Stephen demonstrated promise, whatever Henry's plans were, they were soon altered by an event beyond anyone's control. On the 25th of November 1120, after a major gathering of King Henry I's court in Normandy, the king, his children and illegitimate children, along with senior aristocrats and other courtiers, began their journey back to England. The king had made other arrangements, but the captain of a vessel named the White Ship, Thomas Fitzstephen, made the ship available to others for passage across the channel that evening. What was by all accounts a fairly inebriated royal party, including the king's heir, William Adelin, and numerous courtiers and nobles, as well as several of Henry I's illegitimate children, boarded the ship. There were approximately 300 in total, more than the ship could comfortably accommodate. This proved fortunate for Stephen, who was with the party but decided to disembark and await another ship to travel to England, leaving the inebriated group to proceed without him. Not long afterwards, he possibly witnessed the White Ship strike a large rock that was almost entirely submerged in the harbor. According to the sources we possess, all but one of the passengers drowned, an unusual outcome given their proximity to the shore. One might have expected more to have swum to safety. Among the deceased was William Adelin, King Henry's only legitimate son and heir. His death would leave the succession issue wide open, and as a close male relative of the king, Stephen would become a major participant in the maneuvering that followed in the 1120s. In the immediate aftermath of William Adelin's death, Henry's desire for a child of his own to succeed him became apparent. Despite his lavish promotion of Stephen in previous years, only one option remained: Henry's legitimate daughter Matilda, an 18-year-old girl. She had already been married for several years to Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful feudal lord in a politically fragmented Germany. Despite the fact that she was a woman and was absent elsewhere in Europe, and had been so for many years, Henry moved to designate her as his heir following the disaster of the White Ship. Admittedly, he also sought to strengthen the succession in other ways. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, and Henry remarried shortly after the White Ship incident, this time to Adeliza of Louvain, a daughter of the Count of Louvain, and a woman perhaps little more than 17 years old at the time of the marriage. The hope was that this second union, with someone having many childbearing years ahead, would produce a new legitimate male heir, but there was no success on this front. The marriage would not result in further children for Henry, its barrenness most likely due to the king's own advanced age, as Adeliza would have a child many years later when she married for the second time. What this meant in the 1120s and 1130s was that Matilda remained Henry's only living legitimate child and the heir to the throne of England. There were already indications by the mid-1120s that Matilda would be a tough proposition as Henry's heir. In France itself, it was generally accepted that a woman could not succeed as a reigning queen or a major feudal lady, the belief being firmly entrenched that a ruler's primary duty was as a military leader, and that this precluded women from ruling. The situation was more complex in England, a country that has had numerous female monarchs over the centuries. Henry hoped to appease his feudal lords and secure their acceptance of Matilda as his heir in 1128, when after her first husband, Emperor Henry V, died in 1125, she was remarried to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, one of the more powerful lords of northern France, whose lands lay along the southern border of the Duchy of Normandy. However, this backfired when the unpopular Geoffrey made the lords of England and northern France even more hesitant to accept Matilda as the king's heir. The ill feeling was compounded by high levels of taxation that Henry was imposing at the time to fund several border wars in France. Undeterred, Henry convened assemblies of his lords, including Stephen, on several occasions between 1127 and 1131 to have them swear oaths to accept Matilda as his heir upon his death. Despite these outward displays of obedience, a major question still lingered. Would these oaths be honored after the king's death, or would the lords seek to crown a male monarch? While this political maneuvering and unrest were unfolding, Stephen's personal circumstances were also changing. Like his uncle, King Henry, he had delayed marriage relatively late, but finally in 1125 he married for the first time, by which point he was either in his late 20s or approaching his mid-30s, depending on his birth year. To further complicate matters, another Matilda was involved, the third in our narrative thus far. Matilda of Boulogne was a daughter of Count Eustace III of Boulogne, the ruler of the Boulogne fief near Calais, located at the northeastern extremity of France along the shores of the English Channel. The County of Boulogne was a significant polity in the cross-channel politics between England and northern France. Furthermore, Matilda's mother was Mary of Scotland, a daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland. Hence, Matilda was a niece-in-law of King Henry, her mother having been the sister of Henry's first wife. Accordingly, the marriage was politically astute and became even more important within weeks of the wedding when Matilda's father died without a male heir, and she and Stephen ascended as Count and Countess of Boulogne, further strengthening Stephen's position in northern France and on the southern side of the English Channel. From his new lordship in Boulogne, Stephen continued to position himself as a major figure in the succession politics of the second half of the 1120s and into the 1130s. He remained highly regarded by his uncle, who had facilitated the marriage union with Matilda of Boulogne. Stephen reciprocated by acting as Henry's representative in the region, straddling northern France and Flanders in what is now Belgium. Here, William Clito, the son of Henry's brother Robert, was plotting to become Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful lordships in northern Europe during the High Middle Ages. Henry was eager to prevent this, and Stephen accommodated him by undermining William Clito's efforts. This stood in stark contrast to Henry's relationship with his daughter and heir Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou. They were pressuring Henry to begin transferring power to them before he died, primarily by handing over control of castles and lands in northern France. Their argument that this would smooth the succession for Matilda after Henry's death was reasonable, but Henry did not perceive it as such, and the final years of his life saw a noticeable tension between the king and his daughter and son-in-law. It was under this cloud of deteriorating relations with his family members that old King Henry died at the start of December 1135. Chroniclers of the time suggested his demise was due to consuming too many lampreys, a type of fish. Perhaps this did play a part in his death, but in any event, Henry was well into his 60s by that time, and an old man by 12th century standards. As news of the king's death spread, Stephen was well positioned to establish himself as a potential successor. The king had died in Normandy, and Stephen received the news before most other contenders for the throne, as he was not far away in Boulogne at the time. Geoffrey and Matilda were further south in Anjou, and such was their unpopularity by that time that few supporters rallied to their cause. Over the next week, an agreement was reached with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William de Corbeil, whereby, despite the Archbishop's oath to support Matilda's succession, he agreed to crown Stephen as the senior ecclesiastical lord of England. In a somewhat unusual development, Stephen did not initially encounter military challenges from rival candidates for the throne of England, originating from northern France. Instead, the first 2 to 3 years of his reign were primarily focused on consolidating his position in England itself against fractious lords within England and border incursions from Wales and Scotland. The most pressing issue was to the north, where King David I of Scotland had taken advantage of the temporary lull in English royal authority upon King Henry's death to invade northern England. The lands here, around Northumbria and adjoining shires, were contested between the English and the Scots throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, and a diplomatic shift following a change of monarch was a common trigger for outbreaks of hostilities along the border. This particular incursion was more substantial than others, with David marching well into England and seizing the important northern towns of Carlisle and Newcastle. In response, Stephen marched north early in 1136 and campaigned against the Scots. Clashes over several weeks were sufficient to convince both monarchs of the wisdom of finding a swift resolution. Stephen, eager to end the campaign and return south to continue strengthening his position, ceded Carlisle to David in exchange for peace. With this concluded, Stephen headed south again. No sooner had he returned southwards than Stephen had to deal with an incursion by several Welsh lords into the March region between eastern Wales and the English West Midlands. The Normans had begun efforts to conquer Wales during the reign of Stephen's grandfather, William the Conqueror, but this was only ever a partial conquest and would not be fully completed until the late 13th century. While Stephen was absent in the north campaigning against the Scots, several Welsh lords revolted, winning a significant victory at the Battle of Crugmore in January 1136. By the summer of 1136, a full revolt was underway in South Wales, led by figures like Owain Gwynedd, one of the Welsh princes. Stephen and several Norman marcher lords campaigned aggressively against them in the subsequent months. But as with the Scottish border, Stephen was not committed to achieving outright victory, merely to limiting any potential damage that war might cause. In 1137, he agreed to peace terms through which the English state effectively left the Welsh lords to govern themselves for a generation. That Stephen would make no further effort to intervene in Wales throughout his reign was due to the outbreak of the Civil War that would characterize both his reign and the entirety of English political history for a decade and a half in the middle of the 12th century. The Anarchy commenced in 1138, a civil war that pitted Stephen and his supporters against those who wished to uphold old King Henry's desire for his legitimate daughter Matilda to succeed him. Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou had been determined to challenge Stephen's accession from the very beginning of the reign, but it was not until 1138 that they were in a position to press their cause. The Civil War was ignited when two very powerful English lords agreed to join their cause. These were Robert, Earl of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of King Henry I, and thus a half-brother of Matilda's. He was one of the leading peers of the realm and had made it clear from the outset that he was uneasy with the manner in which Stephen had usurped the throne in December 1135. In 1138, he agreed to take up arms in support of Matilda. Second was Ranulph II, 4th Earl of Chester. He was a leading Anglo-Norman magnate. Some of his lands in the north of England had been sacrificed by Stephen as the price of peace with the Scots in 1136, and his resentment at this led him to join the revolt when it began in 1138. Thus, with support from senior lords on both sides of the English Channel, Matilda and Geoffrey entered open conflict with Stephen. The initial stages of the war occurred in 1139 when the Angevins, so named because Matilda's husband was the Count of Anjou, invaded England from northern France. With the die cast, Matilda's supporters made their allegiances explicit. The deceased King Henry's widow, Adeliza, also lent her support to her stepdaughter in the following months and into 1140. The battle lines were drawn as Matilda's faction gained control over much of northern England, where Ranulph of Chester was one of the preeminent feudal lords. And in western England, with the port city of Bristol emerging as a stronghold for Matilda in the region, bolstered by Robert of Gloucester's strong position here. Meanwhile, Stephen retained control of the bulk of southern and eastern England, a position that gave him control of London, Oxford, and the wealthier parts of England around Kent and Surrey in the south, as well as into East Anglia and beyond. Although some parts of the country would be gained and lost by both Stephen and Matilda's supporters over the years, this was the general geopolitical situation that would prevail for much of the Civil War that was just beginning. Yet often the map was still more complicated as local lords and magnates, or even church figures like the Bishop of Ely, gained control of small patches of land and shifted allegiances back and forth as they sought to benefit themselves during the prolonged period of uncertainty. It was this chaotic situation, combined with the violence and the breakdown of royal government, that partly led to the Civil War becoming known as the Anarchy. The resulting Battle of Lincoln was one of the most important clashes of the entire Civil War, though it likely involved little more than 1,000 men on either side, an indication of the limited scale of warfare in 12th century England. Gloucester and his allies held the advantage due to a large contingent of Welsh auxiliaries who had joined Matilda's cause in 1139. As their position became clear, many of Stephen's most important knights and allies abandoned the field, and the engagement quickly devolved into little more than an attempt by Stephen and a small contingent of knights to fight their way to safety. They were unsuccessful, and by the time the clash concluded, Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester were not merely victorious, but had also managed to capture Stephen. In the aftermath of the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was taken back as a captive by Gloucester to the West Midlands and presented to Matilda. She ordered his imprisonment in Bristol Castle, and discussions then began concerning what course of action should be taken. Matilda had seemingly achieved a clear triumph, but Stephen was a crowned and anointed king, and according to both canon and common law, he could not simply be set aside without a clear legal justification. Consequently, several weeks of negotiations followed, during which several senior archbishops and bishops of the English Church indicated their willingness to support Stephen's deposition in Matilda's coronation as queen, though others refused. Ultimately, the breakthrough came when Stephen indicated from his confinement at Bristol that his supporters should permit Matilda to become queen. In the circumstances, he likely felt he had little alternative, and so in April 1141, Stephen was, to all intents and purposes, deposed, and Matilda became queen. Unusually, she adopted the title Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English, rather than queen. Many chroniclers of the High Middle Ages, and for centuries thereafter, referred to her as Empress Matilda, rather than Queen Matilda, a designation stemming from her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and her status as his Empress. Matilda also continued to employ this title long after departing Germany. This ambiguity surrounding her title mirrored the realities of her limited power. When Matilda and her supporters attempted to descend on London to have her crowned at Westminster, the Londoners rejected her and remained steadfast in their allegiance to Stephen. In this fluid situation, with Matilda having emerged temporarily victorious over Stephen and the king himself imprisoned, yet with parts of England refusing to acknowledge Matilda, the political landscape in northern France also underwent a significant alteration. When news reached the county of Anjou of Stephen's defeat and capture, at Lincoln, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, invaded the Duchy of Normandy and occupied much of it. Stephen's cause was at an extreme low point in the spring of 1141. However, all was not lost. Though himself a captive, his wife Matilda of Boulogne demonstrated herself to be a capable leader of his cause while Stephen was being held at Bristol, and she soon managed to reassemble an alliance of some of England's leading magnates to resist Matilda's ascent to power. They were significantly aided by Stephen's brother, Henry, Bishop of Winchester. They also had the support of William of Ypres, the leader of a substantial contingent of Flemish mercenaries from the Low Countries. In the autumn of 1141, their combined forces marched towards Winchester, where Matilda and Gloucester's armies were attempting to secure the region for her and have the local lords acknowledge Matilda's accession as queen. What transpired at Winchester on the 14th of September 1141 was a direct reversal of the outcome at the Battle of Lincoln 7 months earlier. Matilda's forces were routed and severely defeated, and Robert of Gloucester was taken captive. In the aftermath of the engagement, Matilda of Boulogne and Bishop Henry of Winchester were able to exchange Gloucester's release for Stephen's liberation. Set free at the beginning of November 1141, Stephen began to re-establish himself as king, and in December he and his wife undertook a second coronation as a means of reaffirming Stephen's position as King of England and in an effort to delegitimize Matilda's accession months earlier. Matilda was never formally deposed, and so throughout the 1140s there was a rival queen regnant in the person of Empress Matilda and a king regnant in the person of King Stephen. the anarchy would persist unabated for many years to come, despite the dramatic events of 1141. Having fortunately regained his freedom in late autumn 1141 and begun to restore his authority, it very nearly came to an abrupt halt for Stephen the following year. Early in 1142, he fell gravely ill. The cause of his illness has never been definitively determined. It is quite possible that the circumstances of his imprisonment at Bristol Castle for several months the previous year had weakened his constitution and left him unwell. The conditions might have been such that pneumonia or various other illnesses are possibilities. Whatever the cause, it is evident that contemporaries believe Stephen was on the brink of death in the spring of 1142. Then, somewhat remarkably, he made a swift recovery and embarked upon an energetic new military campaign, one in which he managed to briefly win over Ranulph of Chester to his side in the war before laying siege to Oxford in the autumn of 1142. Empress Matilda was present there at the time, and Stephen came very close to capturing her, something which would have surely led to a major shift in the war's trajectory had he succeeded. It was not to be, however. Matilda and a handful of close supporters slipped out of Oxford Castle under cover of darkness and made their way westwards. After the dramatic events of the years between 1140 and 1142, the years that followed in the mid-1140s saw the Civil War enter a period of stalemate. Neither side achieved a major breakthrough, although simultaneously there were almost constant clashes between regional supporters of both Stephen's and Matilda's causes. The conflict was exceptionally damaging, and many chroniclers of the time noted the devastation sweeping across England and northern France. Agriculture was disrupted throughout the Norman dominions, and there was a general economic decline following a lengthy period of improvement under Henry the Erm. Numerous castles were destroyed, and towns and villages were brutally sacked by roving bands of soldiers on both sides of the divide. It was this pervasive sense of a land enduring years of devastation that led chroniclers to lament it so deeply and for subsequent historians to term it the Anarchy. Like many modern wars, it also spurred innovation. The incessant warfare and the destruction of existing motte and bailey wooden castles led to a rapid adoption of the new concept of stronger stone castles, particularly in England, where motte and bailey fortifications still dotted the countryside. Destructive as the anarchy was, it coincided with a period in the second half of the 12th century and into the 13th and 14th, during which some of England's finest stone castles were constructed. By this time, Stephen was entering his 50s, and Matilda was also well into her 40s. Therefore, as the anarchy continued, its focus shifted over the course of the 1140s from Stephen and his cousin as rival contenders for the throne to their own offspring. Stephen and his wife, Matilda of Boulogne, had several children by then. Their eldest son, Eustace, was born around 1130. From the moment Stephen claimed the throne of England in December 1135, Eustace was next in line to become King of England, though politically his position was clearly marginal while still a child. By the mid-1140s, however, he was old enough to be promoted and was expected to engage in military campaigning himself. In 1146, he was elevated to the position of Count of Boulogne in France, and knighted not long afterwards as his father began preparing him to eventually succeed him. Stephen and Matilda also had a daughter named Marie, born in 1136. In the late 1140s, Stephen began promoting her to play a prominent role in the female religious orders in England, a position which was essentially political in the High Middle Ages. Such was the power and wealth of the medieval religious orders. Another son, William, was married to Isabel de Warenne, the only legitimate child of William de Warenne, 3rd Earl of Surrey in 1148, just a few months after Surrey had died. With this, William was advanced to become Earl of Surrey through marriage at just 11 years of age. Finally, like his uncle Henry the Erm, Stephen also had illegitimate children. The most notable of these was a son named Gervase, whom Stephen had made the abbot of Westminster Abbey in 1138, an important ecclesiastical office which he reportedly abused through his corrupt behavior. All of this was designed to integrate Stephen's extended family into the political and aristocratic world of England and, in the process, secure his dynasty. A similar situation was developing across the English Channel in the county of Anjou. Matilda and Geoffrey had 3 sons in the 1130s. Foremost among these was their eldest son, Henry, an heir who became known to the chroniclers of the time as Henry Fitz-Empress. Fitz meaning son of, the Empress referring to his mother's first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor, and continuing use of the title of Empress. Henry was born in March 1133 and was only a few years younger than Stephen's eldest son, Eustace. As early as 1142, when he was just 9 years old, his parents began involving Henry in the politics of the Civil War and sent him to England to spend time in the household of his step-uncle, Robert of Gloucester. The purpose of this was to personally introduce Matilda's heir to the English lords who supported her cause. Henry, after all, would one day be her successor if she were to emerge victorious in the Civil War. This is increasingly how the Civil War began to evolve in the second half of the 1140s and into the early 1150s. One feature of this was the death of Robert of Gloucester in October 1147. With the passing of one of Matilda's foremost supporters in England, the political and military landscape changed further, so that Stephen and his allies were now more secure in their control of England, while Matilda and the supporters of the Angevins continued to control the Norman dominions across northern France. Another development was the commencement of the Second Crusade to the Holy Land in 1145, which lasted until 1149, in response to the conquest of the county of Edessa by Muslim powers in the Levant in 1144. This drew many of the lords and soldiers who might have continued the war between Stephen and Matilda away from Western Europe to the east. In this environment, Henry attempted to launch several invasions of England in the second half of the 1140s, but these accomplished very little. In one instance, Stephen simply paid off the mercenaries that largely comprised Henry's army and ordered them to return home to France. The final phase of the anarchy occurred in the early 1150s. By then, Stephen's position had been somewhat weakened due to a dispute that had arisen between him and the church authorities in England since the mid-1140s. While Ranulph of Chester continued to hold control over large tracts of northern England, in 1153, Henry Empress, who by then had succeeded as Count of Anjou and could deploy greater resources than on previous occasions, arrived in England again. There he built up support around Bristol and the surrounding region for his and his mother's cause. A period of significant military engagement and clashes followed over several months. Much of it focused on a siege of Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire. On the periphery of Henry and Stephen's spheres of influence, something very unusual happened at this juncture. Many of Stephen's and Henry's closest supporters now indicated an unwillingness to engage in a new round of violent conflict that could destabilize England in a way not seen since the early 1140s. Confronted with this unprecedented situation, Stephen and Henry entered negotiations which were brokered by leading members of the English Church. The outcome was the Treaty of Wallingford, also known as the Treaty of Winchester, which was agreed upon at the site of the siege late in 1153. Under its terms, Stephen, who recognized he now faced a young, energetic, and capable adversary in Henry, and who was also in a difficult position regarding church support in England, agreed that Henry would succeed him upon his death, something many people assumed was not many years away, given that Stephen was around 60 years of age by that time. This entailed Stephen relinquishing the claims of his sons to succeed him as King of England, but would ensure peace during Stephen's final years. The Wallingford Agreement was confirmed shortly afterwards by a more formal treaty concluded at Winchester. The Treaty of Wallingford was a peculiar agreement. Through it, Stephen had effectively renounced the claims of his son, Eustace, or any of his other children, to the throne of England. Eustace was clearly displeased with the decision, though there is debate as to whether Stephen genuinely intended to accept the terms of the treaty or if he was merely buying time to strengthen his position again and would then resume the war and impose Eustace as his heir. This latter theory certainly aligns with some of his actions following the agreement. The months after Wallingford was finalized saw Stephen engaging in a flurry of activity. First, he attempted to reduce the power of Hugh Bigod, a perennially overly powerful feudal lord in England, while also rebuilding his military strength. A setback occurred when Eustace died suddenly and prematurely in the autumn of 1153, though Stephen's other son, William, now became a potential heir to Stephen. Questions remain as to whether Stephen was planning to eventually repudiate the terms of the Wallingford Agreement and attempt to make William his heir, once he had amassed sufficient strength and support for such a move. If this was Stephen's plan, it would never come to fruition. By the time the Wallingford Agreement was reached in 1153, the king was at least 57 years of age, depending on his birth year, and perhaps into his early 60s, old age in the 12th century. Despite his advanced years, he spent the initial months of 1154 traveling throughout England. One major destination was the northern city of York. He then traversed the entire country again, heading for Dover in Kent in the southeast of England. It is plausible that this extensive travel exacerbated some pre-existing illnesses, although Stephen's death may also have been entirely unexpected. In any event, we do know that he fell ill after reaching Kent, complaining of a stomach ailment, and died shortly thereafter on the 25th of October 1154. The precise cause of his death remains unclear. An ailment such as stomach cancer or severe gastritis may have been involved. He was swiftly interred at Faversham Abbey in Kent. Stephen had sponsored the establishment of the abbey just a few years earlier, and both his wife Matilda and their eldest son Eustace, who had died only so recently, were also buried there. The abbey was dissolved and largely destroyed in 1538 as part of the dissolution of England's monasteries during the English Reformation. In 1964, the empty tombs of Stephen and his family members were discovered, and there is a lack of clarity as to where their remains ended up after the 1530s, with local lore claiming their bones were thrown into a nearby creek. This new period of England's history is known as the Angevin Empire, indicating Henry's descent through the House of Anjou and the extent of his territorial holdings on both sides of the English Channel. Under other circumstances, some of England's nobles might have encouraged Stephen's younger son William to press his claims to the throne, but after nearly 2 decades of civil war and destruction, peace was broadly favored by all. Henry II settled into a long reign. He would rule as King of England until 1189, though in time his own fractured family would sow disorder across England and Normandy, while the succession of his son John as king in 1199 ushered in an era in which the Angevins lost the bulk of their lands in northern France. Periods of civil war and disorder would punctuate England's medieval history every few decades for centuries to come. King Stephen has often been viewed unfavorably by historians of England and France in the High Middle Ages. The reasons for this are evident. His lengthy reign of nearly 2 decades was a period of almost continuous civil war, societal disruption, and economic destruction across England, to such an extent that it is known as the Anarchy. The chronicles and histories of the time present a picture of a country ravaged by the conflict between Stephen's and Matilda's supporters. Many subsequent historians have understandably placed much of the blame for this on Stephen, yet this is possibly unfair. The crisis was generated by a succession dispute that was largely created by the nobles of England and northern France, who were unwilling to accept Matilda as Henry III's successor. Had they done so, the chaos could have been averted. When it did begin, it was perpetuated by Matilda, Geoffrey, and subsequently their son Henry. Stephen certainly played a part in all of this, but he was just one participant in the entire unfortunate saga. Conversely, Henry III's promotion of him and the attitude of a great many feudal lords of England and northern France towards him would surely suggest that Stephen was a capable figure with many positive attributes. What was truly at issue were structural weaknesses within the English and Norman state in the 12th century, as well as the sheer happenstance of family composition. If Henry I had fathered more legitimate sons, the anarchy would almost certainly have been avoided. That this was not the case was not Stephen's fault, though there is no doubt about his centrality to the years of war and discord that followed Henry I's death. What is your opinion of King Stephen? Was he responsible for the anarchy, or was he more a symptom than a cause of the Norman state's weaknesses in the 12th century?